Good morning, everyone. Hope everyone had a nice evening in Rome. We're going to talk today, as you know, about reshaping U.S. policy in the Middle East. And rightly or wrongly, I think, in large parts of the region, there's been a perception that the U.S. is disengaging. People talk about how this actually started under President Obama and has continued under President Trump, and either follows or mirrors U.S. public opinion that would like to see, in large part, troops out of hot conflict zones in the Middle East. However, there's the military piece and there's the political piece. So to what extent is it true that the U.S. is disengaging, and to what extent perhaps is it stepping up its engagement? We're going to discuss this from several different angles today. We have a terrific panel with Peter Berkowitz, the Director of Policy Planning for the State Department. We have Thomas Hill of the U.S. Institute for Peace. We have Maha Yahya of Carnegie Middle East, in Carnegie Center, Middle East Center in Lebanon. And we have Vali Nasr of Johns Hopkins University, and an advisor to many important people over years in the U.S. government. So I'm going to hand the floor to you, Peter Berkowitz, first to talk about, tell people what is U.S. policy right now in the Middle East.
Will do. Thank you very much, and thanks for the Med Dialogue to the opportunity. I'm very happy for the opportunity this morning to discuss the United States' enduring commitment to peace and prosperity in the Middle East. Some claim that the United States is reducing its support of partners in the region, or even pulling out entirely. That's untrue. We need to go beyond the headlines and sound bites that are repeated, it seems, in an endless loop. In crucial ways, the United States is deepening its strategic commitment in the Middle East. The United States remains the partner of choice for security and stability in the Middle East, as it is around the world. The United States, of course, recognizes that it can't go alone to deal with the region's problems, particularly in relation to security threats. That requires the support of friends within and beyond the Middle East. Accordingly, the United States organized and continues to lead the global coalition to defeat ISIS. The coalition boasts 76 member states and 5 international organizations. The President has stressed that the United States remains committed to the defeat of ISIS. To that end, we will continue to assist the Syrian Democratic Forces. We are dedicated to countering Iran, the principal source of instability in the region. The sanctions imposed through our maximum pressure campaign have dealt Iran a serious blow. We've also increased U.S. forces to the Gulf. We call on our friends to join in a concerted effort to convince Iran to desist from its malign conduct. That includes its ballistic missile program, and its fomenting of terror and armed conflict throughout the region, and return to the negotiating table. We spearheaded the Warsaw Process on peace and security. We urge our Gulf partners to coalesce around the proposed Middle East Strategic Alliance. Our latest cooperative initiative is the International Maritime Security Construct. It includes naval assets from 6 nations: UK, Australia, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, UAE, and Albania, with more to join. In Yemen, we've undertaken intensive diplomacy in support of UN Special Envoy Martin Griffiths' efforts to broker a political settlement. We welcome the signing of an agreement between the Yemeni government and the Southern Transitional Council. In Libya, we back the UN Special Representative's works to achieve a ceasefire and reach a political agreement. We support the arms embargo. We remain extremely concerned about external actors destabilizing Libya. Their arming of rival militias is causing ever-increasing civilian injuries and deaths and mounting damage to civilian infrastructure. In close consultation with Arab and with Gulf Arab friends, the United States has crafted a proposal for establishing peace between Israelis and Palestinians. In June, Bahrain hosted an international conference in which White House Senior Advisor Jared Kushner presented an economic vision for the reconstruction of Palestinian territory, Lebanon, and Jordan. Even as we partner to promote peace and prosperity, We're keenly aware that people across the region, from Algeria to Lebanon to Iraq to Iran, are protesting corruption and demanding more accountable governments. The United States supports the Lebanese people in their peaceful demonstrations and expressions of national unity. We urge Lebanon's political leaders to facilitate the prompt formation of a new government devoted to a stable, prosperous, and secure Lebanon. This new government must free itself from the endemic corruption that has characterized its predecessors. We applaud the Lebanese Armed Forces' protection of demonstrators. We expect the LAF will continue to defend the people. The United States has a strong interest in a secure and prosperous Iraq. Iraq should be able to defend itself against violent extremist groups and all who would undermine its sovereignty and democracy. The government of Iraq must engage seriously and promptly with Iraqi citizens demanding reform. We deplore the threats to freedom of expression in Iraq. These include the kidnapping and killing of unarmed protesters. Iraqis must be free to make their own choices about their nation's future. Turkey faces credible security threats ranging from domestic terrorism to cross-border attacks from fighters in Syria. Turkey's neighbors include Iran and Russia, from whom the NATO alliance faces significant threats of attack. The United States and other NATO allies are committed to the principles and promise of collective defense. At the same time, President Trump decided to withdraw U.S. forces from northeastern Syria. The Turkish government, against our advice, launched an incursion to establish a narrow security zone. To ensure that this action occurred with minimal loss of life, the U.S. concluded an agreement with Turkey on October 17th to allow for the withdrawal of YPG elements. We expect Turkey to live up to its obligations under this agreement, including no further offensive operations in northeast Syria. We informed the Turkish government on October 22nd that the withdrawal of the YPG from the areas controlled by the Turkish military, as stipulated in our joint statement of October 17th, was complete. On October 22nd, Turkey and Russia reached the deal under which the YPG would pull back 30 kilometers south of Turkey's border with Syria, and security forces from Turkey and Russia would mount joint military patrols. While our forces have pulled away from the border region, we have not disengaged. The coalition has sustained its counter-Daesh campaign in coordination with our local partners. The U.S. has deployed forces to ensure that Syria's vital energy resources, which belong to the Syrian people, not fall again in Daesh's hands. In northern Syria, fighting continues between the Syrian Democratic Forces, the Syrian Army, and the Turkish-backed Free Syrian Army. We're deeply troubled by reports that Turkish-supported opposition groups targeted civilians. We've requested additional information from Turkey, and we have urged the government to investigate and hold perpetrators responsible. We are assessing the credibility of allegations of violations of international humanitarian law. Violators should be held accountable. We remain prepared to reimpose sanctions should Turkey act inconsistently with the commitments outlined in the October 17th agreement. In Syria, we encourage all parties to recognize that there is no military solution to the terrible war that has raged in the country for almost 9 years. We continue to support UN Security Council Resolution 2254. Our enduring presence can be seen, the United States' enduring presence can be seen in peacekeeping and freedom-defending roles in the region. For the last 37 years, the United States has been the largest contributor of money and manpower to the multinational force and observers, a primary guarantor of peace between Israel and Egypt. Our posts are constantly advancing religious freedom, press freedom, and women's rights in the region. We oppose the use of torture, the jailing of activists, the imprisoning of journalists, the arresting of political opponents, and the discrimination against vulnerable minority communities. Finally, the U.S. is addressing great power competition in the region. We've been compelled to keep a watchful eye on Russia and China because of their indifference to or determination to undermine the freedom and openness of the international order. We welcome partnerships in the defense of freedom. Russia continues to support the Assad regime's brutal repression in Syria while shielding the dictator from international scrutiny. China props up the Iranian regime with continued oil purchases. Throughout the region and the world, Chinese investments come with promises of riches, but Chinese financing and construction generate corruption-induced economic dependence and create infrastructure for a worldwide surveillance network. In sum, the challenges in the Middle East are daunting. Let's work together to promote a more stable and freer world. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. So Thomas, I'd like to, this was the official U.S. policy as laid out per Peter. I'd like to now hear your interpretation of what's going on.
Thanks, Amy, and thank you to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and ISPI for hosting this event. I'm going to concentrate my remarks on U.S. policy towards North Africa, although I think in many ways U.S. policy towards North Africa can be seen as a product of our policy elsewhere in the region. With that said, I'll defer to my esteemed co-panelists to cover other parts of the MENA region. I believe that North Africa is an underappreciated piece of the globe by U.S. foreign policy decision makers and maybe beyond the U.S., and has been for several administrations. In part, I think this can be explained by an overshadowing of the region by higher priorities, the geostrategic priorities in Israel, Iraq, Iran, as well as ISIS, and then the major U.S. foreign assistance programs and development programs in sub-Saharan Africa. In the south, below North Africa, to the south, you have the U.S.'s largest health foreign assistance program in the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, or PEPFAR, which was launched under the George W. Bush administration, and then you have the Electrify Africa and Power Africa programs, which formed the cornerstone of the Obama administration's policy towards Africa. So in between those two behemoths, North Africa seems to get lost. The U.S., I think, has chosen to deal with the countries of North Africa as a result on largely a bilateral basis rather than through a regional strategy. The few attempts to introduce multilateral engagements have withered, and I'm thinking specifically about the Trans-Sahara Counterterrorism Program and the failed attempt to launch a Middle East free trade agreement. But in between these competing demands, I think what you see is a deprioritization that's gone on for at least the last two administrations, and overlaying that is a belief that I think is neither Democrat or Republican, that North Africa has really been Europe's backyard, and therefore is Europe's to deal with first and foremost. The belief in Washington has been that of all the places in the world, North Africa really should be the place where Europe is able to project power and project influence, leaving the U.S. to deal with issues elsewhere in the MENA region. So while that policy has its failings, that has certainly been consistent across several administrations. I think you saw that exemplified in the early days of the NATO campaign in Libya, where it was reported out that a senior Obama administration official described U.S. policy as, quote, leading from behind. Now, some have argued that the terrorist attack on the U.S. consulate in Benghazi, which resulted in the murder of the U.S. ambassador and 3 other Americans, has forced the U.S. or politicized Libya for the American policymakers, and that has led to withdrawal. And I don't disagree with that. But there were clearly divisions within the Obama administration before the Benghazi attack about U.S. engagement in Libya. And I think it would be a bit too reductionist to reduce U.S. policy towards Libya to exclusively the attack on the U.S. consulate in Benghazi. In the Trump administration, I think you see a continuation of this reluctance to engage in the region more broadly and specifically in Libya. And because the U.S. is not featured prominently in international gatherings on Libya, Palermo and Paris, Abu Dhabi, et cetera, there's a tendency, I think, perhaps to overanalyze what comes out of Washington in terms of statements or actions to try to interpret what U.S. policy may be. A good example is the phone call between President Trump and Field Marshal Hiftar, which everybody in Washington, I think elsewhere, thought this was a pivot or this represented some change in U.S. foreign policy, which forced the White House then to clarify in subsequent statements about what U.S. policy was on Libya. And several iterations later, what we got was really a restatement of what the policy had assumed to be before the phone call. But the lack of clarity or the lack of visibility of U.S. presence on Libya led many to speculate that the phone call itself represented a policy change. I think that if you can say that there's been a policy change with respect to Libya, I would say it's been recently with the uptick, or at least perceived uptick, of the presence of U.S. or of Russian irregular forces and Russian economic investments, the printing of money for the Eastern government and military advisors in the country. That seems to be the change in terms of U.S. focus. Several high-level delegations in Washington recently have all pushed this need to refocus on Libya because of the Russian involvement. And so if there's been a change, I was going to link it back to something in particular, I would say it's because of Russia's engagement there. I'm assuming that at some point during this panel we'll get into more discussion about Libya, so I don't want to dwell on that piece of it. North Africa is much larger than just Libya. As far as Algeria goes, I honestly, I don't know that Algeria has been a priority for American presidents maybe since 1981, and the Algeria Accords, which were the product or which produced the returning of American hostages from Iran. I know that today in the streets sometimes there are signs being waved by demonstrators that they don't want the CIA involved. I find that perplexing. It's preposterous that the U.S. would be involved at this point. I can't think of a place we'd be less involved in right now than Algeria. So I don't see a change in U.S. policy there, although from my personal perspective, were Algeria to take a turn into a more violent stage or further destabilization of the country, I think that would be enormously detrimental to U.S. policy in the region and our national security interests. And so my own plea to my own government would be to please focus on Libya or on Algeria and think about it and think about the consequences of what's happening there. Not to mention what I think a collapse in or a serious destabilization of Algeria coupled with a failed state in Libya would mean for Tunisia. Now, Tunisia, I think, is maybe the outlier of North Africa in the U.S. context. Tunisia is frequently referred to as the darling of Washington, and I don't think it's an overstatement. And maybe it's only Congress that feels this way, but there is a deep, deep appreciation for Tunisia and the democratic experiment that they have ongoing there. And I think for many foreign policymakers in Washington, Tunisia is seen as a beachhead and an example to the contrary of the argument that the Middle East is never going to be culturally or politically acceptable to democracy, that there's something inherent with Arabs in general that makes them predisposed to not liking democracy. Tunisia is the example that disproves that. And so there's a great deal of interest in working with Tunisia, and I would say Tunisia benefits greatly from U.S. attention. If there's one place in North Africa, and I know I'm running out of time, but maybe you'll just indulge me with a couple more seconds. If there's one place that I think this administration in North Africa has shown interest, it's peculiar in that it's been Western Sahara. And that was perhaps only for a brief moment, but National Security Advisor Bolton made a point of talking about Western Sahara during the rollout of the Trump administration's policy on Africa. He's written about it in his own books. He was deeply involved in the James Baker team earlier on in the negotiations on Western Sahara. Now that Bolton has left the White House, and so I think it's an open question whether there will be continued U.S. interest in Western Sahara, but there was a brief moment where Western Sahara all of a sudden was an issue that the White House seemed to be focused on. And coincidentally, or maybe not so coincidentally, one could make the argument that because Bolton was so interested, that you actually saw some progress on the diplomatic front on Western Sahara. You had 2 high-level meetings of the parties to the conflict. Unfortunately, UN Special Representative had to retire for health reasons. And with Bolton's departure, maybe the momentum has been lost. But that was a brief moment in time where I think maybe there was an opportunity, and there still might be future opportunities to engage on Western Sahara if statements out of Algiers and a transition in Algiers leads to a policy change that may open new opportunities for dialogue. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you.
And we can cover
We
maybe
go
more
back,
places.
We can dip back
Yeah.
into Northern Africa. Maha, I'd like to ask you about your take, of course, on U.S. foreign policy, but also, as we discussed, with the demonstrations in Lebanon and the demonstrations going on in Iraq, what should the U.S. be thinking about in terms of supporting those demonstrators or giving guidance or steer to any people in the government now?
Thank you, Amy.
Thank you.
Thank you, ISPI and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for organizing this. I'll start with just a few comments on the U.S. policy towards the region and kind of the major repercussions, if you want, that are visible, at least on the ground, and then I'll move to the question on protests. I think the U.S. policy in the region has been disruptive in many ways and constructive in others. And it's disruptive mainly because sometimes the policies are they counter each other to some extent, other than changing, decades of stable decision-making within the region. The obvious one, obviously, is the decision, the deal of the century, and the decision to move the embassy to Jerusalem, to recognize declare the Golan Heights part of Israel. I mean, these were things that were part of the negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinians. So these were already handed over way before the negotiations. And I think to people in the region, from the perspective of people in the region, this has completely undermined the potential for a two-state solution. And in the process, I think, undermined the nature of the Israeli state in the future. It's very short-term in the sense that it's catering to a very specific electorate, but in the medium and long term, when it comes to finding an enduring peace in the region, it's very problematic, to say the least. And now with the sense that there might be a recognition, a unilateral recognition of Israel's annexation of settlements in the West Bank, this means that any two-state solution becomes literally impossible to implement. And it's something I think that needs to be considered very seriously, what that means for Palestinians, what that means for Israelis, and what that means for an enduring peace in the region. The other, I think, key element is Iran, obviously, and I'll leave Vali to speak a lot more about this. But Iran is a fixation in terms of, it's the lens through which a lot of the policies towards the region are thought through. Undermining the Obama legacy on this front, but also dragging it back to the negotiating table, having withdrawn from the JCPOA, and I won't go into the repercussions of that, you're all pretty much aware of it. The issue I have here is that we can make the mistake of seeing everything through the lens of Iran in particular. And this is where I would come to the demonstrations that have been taking place in Iraq and in Lebanon. As you're all aware, probably in Iraq there have been demonstrations and protests against the government for at least a month and a half now. And in Lebanon, on October 17th, also there were mass demonstrations that took place, again, against the government, against corruption, against mismanagement, political mismanagement. Now, people have made the mistake of looking at those two as if they are both anti-Iran demonstrations. They're not. I would argue that in Iraq, the anti-Iran element and the anti-foreign interference element is much clearer. Resentment has been building up in Iraq for the last decade, I would say, but it had become more visible in recent years. In 2015, for example, demonstrations against electricity shortages in Basra were calling for Iran to get out of Iraq. The perception amongst a large number of Iraqis is that Iran has been backing this corrupt leadership, and it has been siphoning off Iraqi wealth, and therefore they wanted to stop. They want to retake control of their own state. The bottom line is they see Iran as backing this current and having undermined Iraqi democracy consistently. What's interesting about the demonstrations in particular is that it is a criticism of the Shia leadership from within the Shia community. And I think this is where the similarity to Lebanon in particular becomes very evident. The protests that took place on October 17th onwards, what was unique about them is for the first time you had criticisms of the political sectarian leadership. I forgot to mention that both countries share a power sharing formula. They're governed through a power sharing formula between the different religious groups. For the first time, we saw criticisms of the political sectarian leadership from within their own communities. So you had the Shias criticizing their Shia leadership, the Christians the same, the Sunnis the same. But at no point was there any Iran mention or Hezbollah mention. The trigger for these protests, both in Iraq and in Lebanon, are socioeconomic. It's the sense that people have that their conditions, their living conditions have deteriorated significantly. Their access to health, to education, to water, to etc. In Lebanon, there's been a buildup of just gross mismanagement at every single level. And the sense that the country's wealth and actually the depositors' money in banks is being siphoned off by the political elite who are getting richer at the expense of everyone else. The link to Hezbollah and Iran is not in play at all in Lebanon. And in fact, the protesters have stayed away from the demand to ask Iran to leave Lebanon or get out, or Hezbollah. I mean, there's no mention of them whatsoever. What's interesting is that Hezbollah's reaction was to make these protests about itself. I think and I can go into the details of why that was perhaps in the Q&A question. I think they're caught between a rock and a hard place and not sure how to handle something that is very unique. It's a military organization that is also, I think it stands on two pillars, military and religious ideology, and it's not used to handling dissent, so this is new. I think the US in terms of both protests, but more so in Lebanon, has actually been quite wise in emphasizing the right of people to protest, the right to free speech, the right to gather, and emphasizing the role of the army, insisting on the role of the army and the security forces in protecting that right, but stopping from seeing or at least painting these as yet one more cog in an anti-Iran movement across the region, which frankly would have really truly undermined the protests in a significant way. They're already under attack, and with this foreign conspiracy theory that all the protests are being driven by foreign funders very much in play in the public arena. So I think in this particular case, it's been a very wise decision to kind of stay out at that level, but to continue to emphasize the right to free speech and the right to gather freely. Just one last comment, I think, and probably Vali will talk about this. I think that what happened in Iran in particular, the demonstrations that took place also for socioeconomic reasons, the hike in fuel prices, was in some ways detrimental to Iraq and Lebanon, because for Iran, all of a sudden, it saw that the flames had reached into its own backyard once more. So it doubled down. And what I see in Lebanon is a doubling down, and what I see in Iraq is a doubling down in terms of how much leeway can you give. The way to deal with that leeway is to maintain at least some safe distance and let local actors try and work their way through that. I'll stop right here.
Okay, thank you, Maha. And Vali, I'll let you say what you would like to say about U.S. policy in the region, but I do want to lead with a question to you about this maximum pressure campaign President Obama had one idea of how to eventually get to a better situation with Iran and probably ultimately a normalization of relations and better conditions for the Iranian people. President Trump has taken a completely different tack of applying pressure and kind of boxing them into a corner. So I'd like to know sort of how you would assess that shift and if you think it's been at all effective. Thanks.
Well, thank you, and thank to ISPI for inviting me here. You know, because the Middle East, unlike other regions of the world, does not have any internal organizations, nothing like Organization of African Union or ASEAN or security arrangement, historically has relied heavily on the United States and its strategy in order to provide its stability. Individual countries have their own interests, but it was the United States that provided, by and large, anything resembling a regional strategy. And given where the Middle East is today, with the sort of so many civil wars, collapsed governments, broken states, terrorism, countries invading one another, protests in a second wave of Arab Spring, I think there's much greater sensitivity towards what is U.S. strategy and how effective it is. And I know the U.S. government has its own view. I mean, we've heard about it the past 2 days. But I think the proof of a strategy is not what the United States says, but how it's interpreted by those who are subject to the strategy. And they're far more critical about it. Yes, the United States has decisions. It makes decisions, and yes, they are consequential, perhaps more consequential than decisions that have been taken by its predecessors. The idea of I said that, you know, moving the embassy to Jerusalem, Golan Heights being annexed by Israel, or just a few weeks ago, the United States formally saying that building of settlements is no longer against international law. Moving out of an internationally agreed agreement, the nuclear deal, taking sides in a spat between Saudi Arabia and Qatar, and literally breaking up the alliance that the United States had helped itself create in the Gulf against Iran, the GCC, which hasn't yet been mended. I mean, these are things that will continue in the region going forward. And I can add to that the decision to, as was seen in the region, to abandon the Kurds and essentially turn a blind eye to the Turkish invasion of Arab lands, sort of going back to 1914 in a sense of Turkey being back inside Syria. These are consequential. But do they add up to strategy? And if you're in the region, the answer is no. The region's view is that Russia has a strategy. China has a strategy, which means they have a vision, they have an agenda, and then all of their policies essentially reinforce one another to get them where they want to be, rightly or wrongly. The United States is making decisions that don't add up. I mean, if you really want to shore up the Arab world against Iran, you want to strengthen the Arab world internally, you not only would invest in economic development and build state structures, but you definitely would not move the embassy to Jerusalem. You definitely would not make unilateral decisions on the Arab-Israeli issue, which satisfies the Likud party and a base in America, and is clearly abhorrent to the average Arabs. I mean, you can see, you know, even our Gulf partners have to hold their nose and pretend they're going along, but they're reluctant to sign up to the deal of the century, and that's why this deal is not out there yet. Or if you really want to woo the Iranian people, you don't start off by putting a travel ban on the very people that you want to rise up against the regime, and you don't deny them pharmaceuticals and laud the suffering that they're going under. I mean, yes, they resent their own government, but next to their own government or ahead of their own government, there's now building resentment in Iran. The country that was known to be the only pro-American country in the Middle East is no longer pro-American. For varieties of reasons. And so there's a sense that, you know, these issues don't add up. Yes, there are troop numbers in the region, but warehousing troops in the Middle East does not give anybody a sense of security. So is the US committed to the region? Not if it doesn't respond to what happened with Aramco attack. Not if it doesn't respond to shooting down of its own drone over Persian Gulf. So, you know, the point of counting numbers, 14,000 more troops, 4,000 more troops, is irrelevant to countries in the region if it's very clear that the United States is not going to reinforce is policy on Iran. And obviously, Iran is now the single most important issue, because this region could go either into a major war, or if we end up talking to Iran, essentially you're back to the Obama period, which is basically, we've done all of this. As far as the rest of the region is concerned, you're back to where you started, which is a conversation about the nuclear deal. Maximum pressure works. As a tool, it works. You can decimate a country's economy, and you can bully your allies to go along with you. The United States has proven to be more powerful than it ever thought it was. And everybody's in sort of shock and awe on U.S. ability to wield its economic power. But has it got results? No, my answer is no. In other words, first of all, there's a confusion about what the maximum pressure strategy was for. There were people in the administration, and if you looked at Secretary Pompeo's 19 points, we're basically arguing for regime change. Break this regime until it steps aside and someone else takes over in Iran. And then President Trump on multiple occasions said he's only interested in a new nuclear deal. In Tokyo, he stood up and said he sees Iran prospering under this regime at the podium with Prime Minister Abe. So if the purpose is Iran changes behavior, Iran be something different altogether, or just agree to a sort of a JPCOA plus. This is not clear. It's not even clear to the Iranians what the aim here is. And as different people rotate after the US administration, there's a sense that the strategy is also changing as they go forward. The United States actually has achieved regime change in Iran. It's the wrong regime change. Maximum pressure has brought the hardest, most unfriendly, most mischievous part of Iran to power. Those who are willing to fight the United States, were never supportive of talking to the United States, and want to resist the United States. So I'm not sure that pretty soon, after February parliamentary elections and maybe presidential elections next year, who does President Trump really want to negotiate with in Iran? The government that is most likely to engage with them and actually be willing to sign a deal will not be there. So does he want to deal now with the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards, that they themselves have designated as a terrorist organization only recently in May? So they actually will be talking to the terrorist organization. So that when the IRGC takes over Iran completely, as it's gradually doing so, essentially one of the grand conclusions of this maximum pressure is to basically eliminate any moderation in Iran and make Iran essentially a much more difficult, dangerous country to deal with. Maximum pressure has also made Iran much more willing to be adventurous and risky. Iranians have drawn blood in the Persian Gulf of the kind that they hadn't done in the past 40 years, shooting down a US drone, directly attacking oil facilities in Aramco. And I guarantee you, now that Aramco has issued its IPO, it's even more vulnerable to continuous Iranian attacks because they can gyrate the price continuously. And now that this blood has been drawn and it hasn't been answered, you're dealing with a much more dangerous Iran, which is not worried about killing several hundred people in its own streets or anybody else's streets. And the Iranians have come to a conclusion that the only way to deal with maximum pressure is through maximum resistance. So the sum total of it is that basically I think the Middle East is coping essentially with the way the US is approaching it, but it's not seeing, if you would, a coherent strategy for how the United States is going to get this region to somewhere better, not just in Iran, but in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Libya, in the rest of the region. And I would say, actually, barring serious American leadership, the future is pretty dark for the region.
Thank you, Vali. I think what I'd like to do, if it's okay with all of you, is follow up with Peter, because Vali has just really called out some of the policies, particularly Israel-Palestine and Iran. So I'd like to get your reaction to what he just said, and then I think we should open it up to the floor for questions.
Okay, well, thank you very much. First, on the point that in assessing a foreign policy, it's important to pay attention to how those who are subject to it interpret it, and the coherence of the administration's foreign policy. seems to me there's a clear coherence, in contrast to the previous administration, which sought to appease the United States' historic adversary for the previous 30 years, Iran, and to create distance with its friends and allies, Israel and the Arab Gulf states. The Trump administration has returned to the traditional approach, which is to see Iran, which is fomenting terror, as I've said before, in Iraq, in the north in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, in the south, Yemen, and up through the Gaza Strip back to the Mediterranean. The Trump administration has seen Iran as the threat to stability it is, and has worked to repair relations with Israel and the Gulf Arab states. And it seems to me that that the United States has succeeded in that. I believe the record would show that we have witnessed over the last 3 years historic cooperation between Israel and the Gulf states. By the way, that actually contradicts the claim that was made not once but twice, that the United States' decisions to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital, move the embassy there, and recognize Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights are somehow destructive of politics in the Middle East. It's hard for me to see a connection between those decisions, or for that matter, American policy in regard to Israel and the Palestinians, and the civil war in Libya, the demonstrations in Lebanon and Iraq, which, as you pointed out, are about social and economic matters, not about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's hard for me to understand what the connection is between civil war in Yemen and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And again, those decisions seem not to have distanced Israel's Arab allies. It was Bahrain, after all, that held an international conference in June to discuss the economic parts of the White House peace plan. One other quick comment about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital is merely recognizing the status quo. People often ignore what President Trump emphasized. The recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital does not prejudge the final borders of Jerusalem. It's entirely consistent with East Jerusalem or some part of East Jerusalem being part of a Palestinian state. The president underscored that. As for the Golan Heights, does anybody really contemplate after all these years Golan Heights returning to Syria under Assad, or Iran becoming a staging ground for terrorist activities there? And finally, just to correct a misstatement that was made, a couple of weeks ago, the Trump administration did not say that the settlements in the West Bank are legal. What the Trump administration's, what Secretary Pompeo said very carefully, very clearly, is that they are not per se, that is inherently illegal, and the question of the legality of any particular settlement is up to judicial determination.
Why did he need to say that at all?
Well,
I'm
happy to answer the question. One, because it's true, and it's nice to interject some truth into debate. The debate's about international law. Happy to go over them for you. Second, we have to keep in mind that this is a return to American policy, the policy of the Reagan administration. And third, to underscore that the solution, that making progress in the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians, which we should all wish, is a matter of political negotiation and not legal determination.
I think it's time to turn it over to, I saw your hand pop up quickly. Please just introduce yourself.
My name is Hind Kabawat. I'm the deputy head of the Syrian Negotiation Commission in Geneva. I'm a Syrian lawyer. Just to follow up what Thomas saying about the assumption that the Arab world, they don't appreciate democracy. Just to remind my colleagues here in the audience that in Syria in 2011, what triggered the demonstration is the demand of the people in the street for freedom and democracy. And the outcome of this was 1 million Syrians died, 250,000 detainees. We have 12 million IDP and refugees. And until now, the dictator is still in Damascus with full support of the solid strategy of the Russian and the Iranian to support him. So we really believe in democracy, Thomas, and we are really fighting for this. But this is not our will anymore, because we need a solid US strategy to support the Syrian people. Thank you.
Do you want someone to comment on that up here? Like, maybe do you want Thomas or you want Peter? Peter, okay. Strategy in Syria.
Strategy in Syria. It's been U.S. policy, it will remain U.S. policy to stand with those who stand for freedom and democracy. Wherever we see citizens standing for it, we will find ways to support it. The challenge in Syria is extremely difficult, but to the extent that the citizens of Syria stand up, want support for freedom and democracy, I think you'll find the U.S. backing them. Just as President Trump has come out in support of the demonstrators, the protesters in Iran and in Lebanon and in Iraq.
Thank you. I'm Heinz Gärtner. I'm academic in Vienna. I have a question about the consequences for the transatlantic relations. And listening to you, I can identify these two main conflict areas. The one is the JCPOA. The Europeans still support it, and just yesterday there was a meeting in the framework of the Joint Commission in Vienna and the IEA to discuss how to keep alive the JCPOA. And the second, of course, is the two-state solution. The Europeans strongly support the two-state solution, and the Trump administration appear to drop it. So it seems to be the next conflict area concerning the Middle East between the US and Europe. And I have a more specific question to Maha. What should the Europeans and the European Union do to support this two-state solution? Should the European Union recognize Palestine as a state officially?
Should I?
Yes, go for it.
Yes. Yes. I mean, today I have to disagree with my eminent colleague here, but I think that giving away key negotiating issues, Jerusalem was a key point of negotiation for the final status. The Golan was a key point of negotiation in the final status negotiations. The settlements are a key issue. The economic summit that was held in Bahrain was boycotted by a large number of countries from the region and people in the region because it is seen, and even I won't go into the economics of the deal itself, which are incredibly problematic. So the only way the Europeans can push back is, yes, perhaps by recognizing an independent Palestinian state. The question is, over what? I mean, at the end of the day, the way even today, the status today of Palestinian Authority, the kind of Swiss cheese geography it controls is not a state. It simply is not a state. And the idea was that this would somehow be resolved in some final status negotiation. Quite honestly, I think the two-state solution was already on its way out quite some time before these decisions were taken because of the changing facts on the ground. You cannot control, you cannot claim a state over literally territory that is punctured with roads and settlements across it. So in short, for the Europeans, I think they need to make a much stronger stance in terms of their support for a two-state solution, lay out exactly what that means and how they see the international community working towards that, what they expect from their partners, and yes, perhaps recognize Palestine as an independent state, pending final status negotiations.
My name is Mohammed Nusayr. I come from Egypt, from the private sector. I'm also board member of Egyptian-American Friendship Association. My question is to Dr. Peter. Since Iraq war till now, do you think the United States is more popular in the region or less popular? And why is the reason, being popular or less popular? And I have also to remind you that most of the Middle Eastern region are ruled by autocratic regimes. So whatever you are doing agreement, you're doing with a single person or very small, tiny regime. You're not doing with the people. So if democracy appears in the Middle East, how do you see the United States relationship with many countries? Thank you.
My sense of it is that in some places the United States popularity has declined. In other places, the United States, there's still recognition that the United States remains the greatest friend for peace and prosperity in the Middle East. I agree with you. You didn't quite say this, but I think that the United States has learned lessons from the 2003 invasion of Iraq and the efforts to promote democracy and freedom. One can see in both the Obama administration and the Trump administration a retreat from the grand ambitions of the Bush administration. But I think it certainly remains the case of this administration that where there are opportunities, where there are civil society opportunities within the Middle East, where we see those who are demonstrating and demanding from their governments accountability and freedom, our posts in our government will seek ways to support those protesters, those who are demanding freedom. Recognizing the tremendous complexity, as you point out, in this region.
Can I add to that,
Please.
Peter? How do you balance the need to support people without being interventionist? Because you go in and people could protest and say, we don't want your help. You pull back and they say, well, where's America's moral leadership?
Well, it seems to me you distinguish kinds of interventions. On one side of the one side of the spectrum, you have military intervention. On the other side of the spectrum, you have interventions as mild as student exchanges. By the way, in saying mild, I don't mean to disparage the importance of increased student exchanges or programs to help with the educations of young girls, or programs to educate the judiciary and the free press, or programs to promote freedom of speech and freedom of religion. Those are much more modest. And I'll make one other point, if I may. In the early 2000s, the United States somewhat interchangeably used the language of democracy promotion and the freedom agenda. But it's my observation that to speak of democracy promotion is more menacing because it implies a change of regime. Autocrats are reluctant. But to promote freedom is actually consistent with the regime's continuing on, even as it lays the framework, lays the foundations for a more open society where there's more accountability to the people. So not just couching your interventions in terms of freedom, but focusing on areas in which the United States can increase freedom within civil society, it seems to me, is a way that the United States, consistent with lessons learned, can continue to support our friends who support freedom in the region.
Thank you so much. I'm Kamran Palani from Middle East Research Institute in Iraq. I just have a comment on Maha. I disagree with the idea that socio-economic factor explains the protests and the changes in Iraq. Just to be more nuanced, what's happening, the demonstrations are only happening within Shia provinces or Shia majority provinces in Iraq. So far, the Sunni majority provinces and the Kurdish provinces haven't joined the protesters. So it challenges our idea that this is the whole Iraq is protesting. So this is still two major components of the Iraqi society not joining the protesters. I think what's happening is a response to the failure of the political system that has been in place in Iraq since 2003. Just quickly, Iraq's economy depends, 90% of the budget depends on oil. 2/3 of it goes to the government expenses, government salaries. The government is based on the sectarian, ethno-sectarian power sharing between the three major components. And it has a deeply fragmented security and military force. So there is no socio-economic answer to the crisis of Iraq, at least in the short term. So what's happening is the crisis of governance and the political system in Iraq, which there is no immediate answer. And what's happening is that you have got now two sides. One is like, it's called the people, and the other is the authority. In this context, I don't think socio-economic policies can be helpful in addressing this crisis of governance and political system in Iraq. Thank you.
Yes, go ahead.
Sorry, I think you must have misunderstood, or I didn't explain myself clearly. At no point did I suggest that the response in Iraq is a socioeconomic one. I said that it's socioeconomic realities that triggered the demonstrations, but absolutely it is about governance. And it's the same in Lebanon. It's about the mismanagement, the political and economic mismanagement of the country by sectarian political elite. The difference between Iraq and Lebanon is that in Iraq, the link between the mismanagement itself and the perception of Iranian interference is much more clearer than it is in Lebanon. I mean, the situation in Iraq reminds me a bit of the Lebanese with the Syrians. When the Syrian regime was present, this is pre-2005, when the Syrian regime was actually controlling many of the levers of power in Lebanon and manipulating politicians. I mean, things went the way the Syrian authorities wanted. So that kind of relationship, big brother, small brother, whichever way you want to put it, is much more clearly directed and evident in the demonstrations in Iraq vis-a-vis Iran than they are in Lebanon. That was, but absolutely both are about the protests, with regards to the mismanagement of the country. And on the other components in Iraq, which is another singular difference, if you want, with Lebanon, it's true that demonstrations have not taken place in predominantly Sunni areas or in predominantly Kurdish areas at this point, but they have taken place in the past the Kurds have been demonstrating against their own leadership, and in the Sunni provinces we've seen the same. What's interesting to me is we've seen some signs and small demonstrations taking place here and there in solidarity with demonstrators in Iraq, in Baghdad. And I think it's important. There has been clampdown. There's been an attempt not to have them demonstrate, but there are signs of solidarity across the provinces, which is also a very important development in Iraq that we need to hold on to. It is an indictment of the political class across the spectrum and of their mismanagement.
I'd like to jump in and ask Vali now about the demonstrations in Iran, because in 2009, President Obama took a lot of heat for not supporting demonstrators. We've seen demonstrations of a similar magnitude, and they've become more violent this time around. I mean, how do you assess how the United States administration has responded to those, and what should they be doing, in your opinion?
Well, I don't think the United States was any more supportive than the Obama administration was in 2009. In fact, I mean, the Republican criticisms of President Obama for not doing more, notwithstanding, President Trump sent a tweet essentially after the demonstrations had already been quelled. And some of the comments that were made by other administration officials was sort of more claiming a victory for the maximum pressure strategy than there were actually any solution to the person on the street that might have been looking for. But the larger issue is there's not much the United States can do, just like it's not much it can do in Iraq and in Lebanon either. I mean, expressions of support are fine. That sort of is expected. But you can't send in the cavalry to change the regime. There's nothing material that can be done. And there's also a big difference between 2009 and 2018 and 2019. 2009, the demonstrations were as a result of an event internal to Iran, which is a perception by a large number among the population that the result of the elections did not reflect the vote. The United States had nothing to do with instigating the demonstrations. This time, even according to the officials who were claiming credit for the demonstrations, the United States is the cause of the demonstrations. In other words, by trying to break Iran's economy, that you have created a situation that is combustible, and the government's attempt to deal with the budget deficit by removing subsidies for fuel caused an eruption. So the United States, in a way, is part of this issue, and support means what here? It means that I'm going to starve you, and then when you start acting up because I'm starving you, now I'm going to tell you, how supportive I am of you. But in reality, for the average citizen who is desperate and is lashing out, yes, they're lashing out against their own government, but the United States should not forget that there is no love for the United States in this. The United States is the cause of the people suffering as a result. The governments don't get along, but it's the people of Iran that have been put in a position to pay for this. And again, as I said, I don't quite understand the expression of support for a people when you deny them medical, pharmaceutical things, when the first thing you do when you come to the office is to put a travel ban on the very people that you are trying to encourage to be supportive of you. And the Iranians understand what maximum pressure means. It means I'm going to choke you until you throw out your government, but I'm still choking you. And this doesn't bring any kind of pro-American sentiment for the United States. I think these ideas, these are much more Washington conversations. It's self-congratulatory. We sent the tweet 3 days sooner than Obama did. We said something bigger than Obama did. But in reality, I don't think it has had a material impact, and the United States had absolutely no impact on the outcome of the demonstrations or where they go from here.
Let's go back to the audience. Any questions for,
thank you
sure,
very much.
Sure, Maha.
Now it's working, okay. Just on what it can do vis-a-vis Iraq, I think we're already seeing the beginnings of this, but a much stronger position on the use of lethal force against protesters. Hundreds, by last count, I was reading 400, but it might actually be much larger. Innocent protesters, peaceful protesters have been killed in Iraq over the past month and a half. Thousands have been imprisoned. And I think a much stronger position on the use of lethal force is important. The US has leverage in Iraq, far more leverage than in other places, and it can use that leverage in that way. I think that's quite fundamentally important. The issue of maximum pressure actually is interesting because it's a narrative that's beginning to play out in Lebanon as well, because of sanctions against Hezbollah. In the last round of sanctions, one of the smaller banks, which actually interestingly in April had just signed a major deal with USAID, was sanctioned, and the bank went bust completely. So there is a narrative that is now emerging that the maximum pressure through sanctions, economic pressure, is debilitating Iran. It's prevented Iran from being able to transfer funds or sufficient funds to Lebanon, to Hezbollah in particular, and that therefore also the economic pressure within Lebanon is partly what has caused, or has played a role, I shouldn't say it has caused, but it has played a role in this. So it is being spun to some extent as an American conspiracy, but until now, for the most part, people are not biting, to say very.
Okay, thank you. Peter wanted to jump in and respond.
Yes, please. 3 quick points. One, the Trump administration has actually made clear over the last year that its policy in Iran is not regime change, but to induce Iran to come back to the negotiating table. Second, maybe it's true, but it's sad to me if it's true that the Iranian people, in a monolithic way, blame the United States exclusively for their sufferings and deprivation. Sufferings and deprivations stem from the fact that the regime has decided to make war in Yemen, in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, and the Gaza Strip, and maybe other places, expend a great deal of money there and incur pushback. And finally, on support, what statements can mean. I was present about a month ago at a public conversation with Jimmy Lai. Jimmy Lai is an entrepreneur in Hong Kong who's been leading the protests there. And he was asked, what can the United States do in support of those who are demanding freedom in Hong Kong? And he said, well, I'll tell you. He said, we don't need any of your tanks, and we don't need more tariffs on China, and we don't need lower tariffs on China. What we need from the United States right now is to not be embarrassed about its principles and to defend them forcefully in the international public sphere. When he said that, he was echoing something that Natan Sharansky said, who was a Soviet dissident back in the 70s, back in the 80s, sorry, about the importance of Ronald Reagan speaking out for freedom. So I do not underestimate the importance of other factors, but the United States speaking forcefully in defense of freedom can be an important factor in international affairs.
Thank you.
So thank you very much for giving the floor. I'm Antonietta Lee. I'm associate professor at University of Santiago de Compostela, Spain. And it's not a question. I have just a few points for all the distinguished panelists, in particular for the director, Mr. Berkowitz. I'm a jurist, so you already said about specifically about the situation in Jerusalem, that it's a question of, it's a matter of political negotiation before of a legal determination, if rightly I have understood. But from my point of view, that's the point. We must reshaping, we must restore the role of law to promote rule of law. We should remember that rule of law means to have a framework, a legal framework that at international level will altogether decided after the Second World War under United Nations. So from that decision depends also, and I'm referring also to your question of promoting freedom, using law also helps us about the decision to which kind of freedom we want to promote. Because freedom without social justice, at the end of the day, it's the freedom of few to let free the majority free to live in poverty. So law and politics should be hand in hand, I mean. So that's just a few observations. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
If I may quickly say that I quite agree with you that the rule of law is essential to the protection of freedom and central to the American view of resolving these conflicts. But we can't ask law to do things that it can't accomplish. Well, once again, at least as I see it, it was never up for negotiations whether Jerusalem is Israel's capital. What is up for negotiations, and is still up for negotiations and can't be settled by law, is the question of what the final boundaries of Jerusalem will be. That's not a legal question. That has not been taken off the table by the Trump administration. We should continue to negotiate. So the trick is to understand which are the matters that are political and subject to negotiation, and which are the matters that indeed need to be settled as legal matters.
Can I ask you, Peter, that I sort of did interject when you were speaking before, but what was the purpose of making the statement about settlements? What did it aim to achieve at this particular juncture?
Well, again, I can't tell you why exactly in October 2019 rather than September or the month after, or was it November? Recently, I can't tell you why. But what it was intended to do was remove actually obstacles to successful negotiation. Again, I repeat, Secretary Pompeo did not say the settlements are legal. He said that they're not inherently illegal, meaning that every building and construction beyond the Green Line, by the way, which was an armistice line from the late 1940s, is sacrosanct, not inherently illegal. The purpose is to remove illusions that the conflict could be solved by some kind of legal determination, to encourage a return actually to the negotiating table, so that the Israelis and Palestinians face to face can resume the conversation. And I must say the truth is that the Israelis have reiterated their willingness to sit down. It's the Palestinians who, since December 2017, yes, in response to the Trump administration's recognizing what I would say is reality, that Jerusalem is Israel's capital. It really was never subject to negotiation, that Jerusalem would cease to be Israel's capital. The boundaries, subject to negotiation. So, by removing illusions about what could be negotiated, the Trump administration hopes to encourage actual negotiations that will result in peace, so that the two peoples can live in peace and prosperity together.
I think the reaction in the Arab world was that this was making the U.S. seem like less of an even broker at a time when it already often is criticized for being that way.
Well, I would only say this, just as we should be careful when we speak about the American point of view. The Arab world is a big world, 350 million people. I myself am reluctant to speak about a single opinion dominating the Arab world. There are many nations in the Arab world. They have different interests, sometimes conflicting interests, and I think you will discover, in fairness to the Arab world, actually a diversity of opinions on this matter, some accepting of the American point of view.
Vali wants to jump in.
So I just want to say, Jerusalem is not an Arab issue. Jerusalem is a Muslim issue. There's 1.7 billion Muslims. You could go to Indonesia, Malaysia, Nigeria, and that decision did not go well anywhere. And it was seen as a unilateral decision that was not necessary. And end of the day, Jerusalem was on the table when at the end of the Clinton administration, the last serious conversation has always been on the table as a joint capital of the two countries. And ultimately, I think the expectation of the Arabs was that even if the United States was going to do this, at least it would have minimally got something for it, even something to give the Palestinians to say that, you know, we think that this is not negotiable, we think that this is done, but it's not a total gift to Israel without any kind of a compensation. But I think it undermines the notion that the United States is an honest broker here. And if the U.S. is going to play a role in the region, it has to at least maintain some minimum defense of what it is that the Arabs want. The Arabs may not be able to get these things, but there's no question that Arabs and Muslims care about Jerusalem. And this issue may come up again. You know, just because we're busy with wars right now in the Middle East does not mean that the Muslims are going to forget about the Palestinians or are going to forget about Jerusalem. And, you know, next time these things blow up, we're going to have books written, shows done about, you know, who missed the boat at what point in time. We're going to revisit this moment at some other point in time.
In 1995, Congress passed and the Clinton administration signed an act which recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital. This is not a departure from Clinton administration policy. It's true that the president and subsequent presidents signed waivers. Just as then, just as now. The recognition does not resolve. What I recognize is the key issue. The ultimate boundaries, whether there's going to become a kind of sharing, that's still up for negotiation.
Okay. Yes. Mr. Sajjadpour.
Actually, I add
Sure.
the same point because I'm Shireen Shille. I'm from Palestine. I'm living in Palestine, in Ramallah.
Now,
You're next.
Yeah. So hearing the statements that you just made,
and what happened recently in the Palestinian areas, and what's as Palestinians are suffering because of what's U.S. recent recognition of Jerusalem, or even the statement about settlements. These things are not something that U.S. just can find it as simple as that. We as Palestinians who's living in the area are really suffering daily from being in a place where it is surrounded by settlements that we cannot move from one place to another. And they are expanding in a way that we as Palestinians have no other space to expand and live normally. So these issues is not something that can be just said and then we can go back to the negotiation table and think about the borders and these things. These statements made our position as Palestinians weaker and weaker, and will increase even the harm feeling and the let's say the suffering of the Palestinian living in that area, as well as the Arab position against Israel, or against even the presence of Israel within the Middle East. So if we're thinking about really making a real peace, we should take into consideration the rights of the Palestinian who's living under occupation since so many years without real improvement on their human rights, or on their rights of living as humans on their land. So these things cannot be just taken as normal, regular statements that can be taken by the U.S. government.
Can we get Mr. Sajjadpour's question in too? And then I think we're going to have to give everyone a chance to wrap up because we've got 3 minutes left. So
Thank you so much for giving me time. I'm Qasem Sajjadpour from Iran. From the region, to me as a analyst, the U.S. policy toward the Middle East is the most confused policy ever I have seen. And I want really clarity from the panel. What is the base of U.S. policy? Can you tell me what U.S. is for in the Middle East? And here I see from outside a big difference between what we call deep state and the president. And there is a reflection of this division in the Middle East. Look at the issue of the Kurdish issue, the support for the Kurds in northern Iraq. So it personally, president decided versus the establishment. So how the panel sees this issue of deep state versus personality? Furthermore, what are the driving forces of U.S. policy in the Middle East? For me on JCPOA, as an analyst, I see the role of Israel, UAE, Saudi Arabia, and their lobbies more important maybe than any other factor. And the money is also there. I mean, Trump's money link. So how do you see this issue of personality versus deep state, and the issue of money in all this confused policy? Thank you.
Okay, so I'll give you, Peter, a chance to answer that, and then I'd like you all to actually just make a few final comments. Keeping in mind one issue we didn't bring up, which is if the U.S. is seen as pulling out of any particular areas, Russia moves in. And I think there was, at least on the part of President Trump when he was campaigning, a hope that he could work together with Russia to crack down on ISIS. Clearly, the situation has evolved in such a way that that's not really worked out. But what do any of you see as a potential for or need for Russia and America working together in any of these hot spots across the Middle East? Thank you.
So in conclusion, let me briefly address the question
Yes.
about Palestinians and Jerusalem, and then a quick comment about Russia. I agree. Palestinians' rights should be respected. And I believe steps can be taken, certainly to increase mobility and autonomy for the Palestinians. I don't see the connection between those urgent matters and recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital. It seems to me, consistent with that recognition, more could be done, by the way, by Gulf Arabs, by the European community, and this was part of this big part of the economic plan proposed by the White House at Bahrain. massive investments in infrastructure to improve the prosperity, the quality of lives, transportation. I recognize that's not everything, but it's something, and it is not at all precluded, as I see it, by recognition of Jerusalem's capital. Russia. Yes.
And yeah, quickly, because I'm getting the wrap.
This is a huge problem. I'll only say that Russia in Syria has not prevented the United States from conducting, with 75 other partners, a very successful campaign against ISIS, which was the administration's declared policy.
Everyone else, quick wrap up.
All I can say is I think today's discussion is illustrative of the point I was trying to make earlier, which is that North Africa is consistently overlooked and underappreciated, but as so often occurs. But which is disappointing, because I think if you look at North Africa for its direct impact on Europe and its stability of Europe, North Africa plays a much greater role than any of the topics we covered today, which has a direct impact on U.S. national security interests because of our NATO alliances and our longstanding relationships with European allies that are so critical for the work we're trying to do elsewhere. So,
thank you, Thomas.
Very quickly, cannot buy peace. There's an economic plan for the Palestinian-Israeli that was discussed in Bahrain, but it won't buy peace. And I think it's we cannot also distinguish between a legal status and political negotiations, as if it's okay in political negotiations you can overlook legal status. I think legality, international legal frameworks have to be on the table as the starting point. Whether political negotiations then choose to overlook them, that's a different thing. But we cannot immediately dismiss the idea that there are legal frameworks, international legal frameworks, UN resolutions that have been accepted by most of countries around the world. And I think also we need to consider immediate neighbors versus distant neighbors. So while Bahrain may have hosted this economic summit, the immediate neighbors of Israel and Palestine, the Palestinians, Jordanians, Lebanese, Syrians, are not, for the most part, are not endorsing this. And that, I think, is much more significant for the well-being of any solution down the road. Finally, just on Syria, because it was surprising that we didn't talk a lot about Syria today, even though it's a linchpin in any kind of future stability for the region. I think the US's position also in Syria, one foot in, one foot out, has, yes, opened the door for Russia and for Iran to expand, and has actually allowed the regime that the US is ostensibly against to regain its foothold and expand territorially in ways that it would not have been possible, I think, before. And I think it's something we need to keep in mind, because it gives the sense that the US does not stand by its allies. It's thrown the Kurds under the bus as far as the Kurds are concerned.
Thank you, Maha. I don't mean to cut you off, but we're over time, so Vali.
Very quickly, I mean, I did initially say that the US policy was not understood with clarity in the region, and I do agree with you. But I would say on Russia and China, as I would add, they have their own national interest. And ISIS, or fight against terrorism, is a 2-3 year short-run project. It may be over, it might move to another country, it might move to another part of the world. Those countries have 25, 50-year vision for the Middle East. They're following a very different strategy. This idea that, they're welcome to support our strategy is not going to work. And actually, I think part of the problem is that the United States actually does not have an understanding of what Russian strategy or what the Chinese strategy is, and it's very different from ours. They have very different, for instance, theories of relations across the Gulf. The Chinese and the Russians do not support confrontation in the Gulf. It's not to their benefit. They want both sides to get along so they could sell and buy from both sides of the Persian Gulf. They're not supportive of our policy of actually giving weapons to one side and egging them on to contain the other. And I think the vacuum that the US has created is not easily now filled again. I think that's part of the issue. We can't just snap back and think that we're just going to go do what we wanted, and the Russians and the Chinese are just going to go home.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated for the next section is about to begin. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats.